Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'll just give you all a few moments to start filing in. My name is Moira Junge, the CEO of the Sleep Health Foundation. Welcome, very warm welcome to our sleep seminar series for tonight. I'll just give everyone a minute or so just to make sure they've got the right connection, being in the right room, and we'll make a start. In a minute, I'll hand over to our Chair of the Board, Professor Shantha Rajaratnam, to do some introductions and introduce our very special guests for today. Just as we're waiting for people to come in, I wanted just to let you know that we can't see you or hear you during the webinar tonight, but we'd very much like to hear any questions you have. The chat function is disabled, but we have the Q&A function that you'll see if you'd like to make any, have any questions for Tom, our special guest, afterwards. So as I said, I'll just give it another minute or so and we'll make a start. Okay, Shantha, I think I might hand over to Shantha to welcome you all and make a start to the webinar.
Thanks, Moira, and welcome everyone to this webinar that has been organised by the Sleep Health Foundation. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today. I'm joining you today from the lands of the people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge that these people have been meeting on these lands for millennia and have been educating and researching on these lands for that entire period. And mental health has been a core area of focus as well, and well-being in our First Nations people. I'd like to say a few words about the Sleep Health Foundation before we move on to the conversation that we're hosting today. So the Sleep Health Foundation is Australia's leading advocate for sleep health. We represent the broad community interests in sleep health, and this represents the perspectives of health professionals, researchers, but importantly also consumers, those affected have some lived experience in some way of poor sleep, and also all of the industries that are critical to furthering the sleep health mission in Australia. And so we were established to really serve in that key advocacy and education role. We launched this webinar series in September 2022 because we felt that it was important to connect the public with topics of importance and interest in the area of sleep health and how sleep health can touch upon multiple areas of our lives. And today we're going to be talking in more detail about mental health and well-being. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to introduce our guest today, Tom Boyd. And I have to say that I've been a great fan of Tom's for many years as well. So it's wonderful to welcome him to this webinar. So as you would know, Tom is really well known in the Australian sporting landscape, having come through the AFL ranks. Many of us felt that he really could single-handedly change the fortunes and success of his club for many years to come. But not even a drought-breaking premiership with the Bulldogs in 2016, after which was arguably Tom's best football really performance, could stop the issues that he was suffering as his insomnia and mental health hit new lows. he felt that something drastic needed to be done to break this circuit. And in 2019, he made the difficult decision to walk away from his AFL career. We are really fortunate to have Tom joining us today. At the age of 24, he communicates his story brilliantly to young people, adults, to experts in the area of sleep and mental health, because his story really transcends across many demographics. And so we're thrilled to have him here today. I'm going to hand back to Moira Junge, who's our CEO, to just begin this conversation with Tom and hear about his journey with sleep and mental health.
Thanks, Shantha, and hello everyone again. Tom, let's have a very casual conversation. The audience will know we've just got the 30 minutes, so we'll keep it short and sweet. And I want to invite questions from the audience anytime. You can put it into the Q&A function, or you can unmute yourself at the end, and we can have a chat. So what we wanted to talk about really was hear more about Tom's journey, as per the introduction from Shantha. And Tom, I followed you on and off for a long time as well, on and off the field. I want to start with knowing how your sleep is with your newborn baby girl last year. What's your sleep like at the moment?
Well, thank you for having me. It is great to be here this evening. I think first, I won't be able to sleep at all tonight if I don't correct the fact that I'm 27, not 24. Maybe I still act 20. Maybe I still act 24 at different stages of my life, but 27. As you said, recently became a father to young Armani, and she's just turned one on Easter Sunday actually, and. I think one of the things with a newborn at different stages, particularly right in the beginning, you're kind of in the midst of, mums trying to adjust to this new life form that they're looking after now, after obviously having them in the womb for 9 months. And then there's the sort of planning around whether me as the breadwinner at the time or at this current moment was going to work, and then trying to work out how to deal with the sleepless nights together. And I think the best thing that I can say is that we have been very lucky with our daughter. We've been able to have good stints of time where she sleeps through the night. Certainly there's been moments on and off over the course of a 12-month life that she hasn't. But at the same time, I think like most things, right, we watched a lot of our friends go through it. We watched a lot of our friends make decisions that we perhaps didn't quite agree with in terms of the way they dealt with sleeplessness with their children, and particularly trying to juggle work and the sleep fatigue, who was going to do the heavy lifting over the course of the night. And I think Anna and I have just gotten to a point where we're very comfortable with our different roles and how that changes through the course of a weekday versus a weekend. And also, what our responsibilities are as part of an entire household rather than simply just being individual people in a partnership.
Yeah, that's great. Great to hear. So we've brought you here tonight really to talk about your role as an elite athlete, and now you've had a really exciting role. You're telling me before you're busier than ever at the moment as well. Can you tell us about the pressures of being in elite sport and the effects on sleep and the effects on your general well-being?
Yeah, there's probably a few things I would make mention of. One is that keep in mind, as the football public, you only see our performance based on 2 hours on a weekend. And that is essentially what we get judged on as players. It's what we get remunerated on. It's what we get held up into the regard that we are, not only within the four walls of our footy clubs, but also within the broader competition. It's what keeps us in contract. It's what gets us out of trouble. It's basically everything, right? And so over the course of a 22-game season, a 23-round season, you've basically got 44 hours to prove yourself versus the thousands of hours that go into the preparation that lead into those moments. And I think if you consider the fact that the game itself is such a small microcosm of the entire experience of AFL, you can understand why there is such a heightened anxiety and stress placed on performing at those 2 hours. And I think the second thing is, and this was something that my psychologist told me and sort of really blew my mind about, is that one of the greatest challenges when you're playing elite sport at any level, and particularly if you're trying to perform, so you're in sort of game season rather than pre-season, is that when you have a spouse or a partner at home, there's a difference between a footballer lying on the couch versus a regular person lying on the couch, and and it sounds silly, but that difference is that the job of an AFL footballer when they're at home is to recover, to do their job as well as they can the next day. And sleep is a huge component of that. And I think over the course of, a long storied history of young parents and AFL footballers going through, having infants and sleeping in hotel rooms before big finals, the footballer public have gotten a small glimpse into the challenges that many of these young men and women face. But when it comes back to the pressure point of view, what I found was that because there's such a heightened awareness about trying to get the most out of yourself on a Saturday, let's say, that from a Thursday night after our main training session, when I've set my sights on performing for that weekend, I've basically done the vast majority of the heavy lifting when it comes to preparation. My sleep cycle started to get very, very heavily impacted because I was starting to manifest what it would look like and what it would feel like to perform poorly often, because that's the way, from a self-critical side of things. And I think probably an over-critical and analytical mind that I tend to have. It was a constant cycle of, I don't want to mess it up on the weekend. And I think that at different stages that heavily impacted my sleep. And not to mention, so I would say in that sense or that regard, I'm quite a unique case, at least for the experiences that I got to where, I sort of hadn't slept for a couple of weeks. But, it is a common and well-accepted reality of playing night games in the AFL football scene that you often don't sleep almost at all the night after one of those games. There's also a heavy acceptance on the fact that there are late flights, there are red-eye flights, there are hotel rooms, there are all these things that we are, not capable of controlling in terms of the sleep environment, which, from my perspective, is one of the most important things to get quality sleep. And I think when you couple all those things together, along with the sort of physical fatigue that's associated with elite sport, it can be quite overwhelming, specifically for young players who haven't quite worked out where they stand.
Yeah, I mean, and probably also caffeine, I guess, in a lot of the perhaps part of the training and part of the. I wonder whether what's the role of caffeine? Do you remember what was that was when you were an elite footballer?
Yeah, I remember I used to have about 4 or 5 coffees a day because, and it sounds excessive and perhaps it is, but there is, in a normal training session during a preseason, you wake up at 6, you're at the club at 7, you're getting strapped and prepared to 8 o'clock. You have a meeting from 8 o'clock till 9 o'clock. And then, somewhere in there, you've got to spark up for the meeting. And then you go through the meeting and fall asleep. And then you've got to spark up for a 15-kilometre training session. So you have another coffee. Then you get off the training track. It's lunchtime. So you go eat a bunch of food and your insulin levels go all over the place. So you go, I need another coffee to get through the afternoon. And depending on the cycle of the training session, so a typical afternoon is a combination of cardio, weightlifting, and some form of recovery. So Pilates or, massage or something like that, at least in the Bulldogs schedule. If I come off lunch and I go into weights and then I go to a massage where I'm lying face down or on my back for an hour or 40 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever it is, and then I've got to go and do a boxing session, you can probably bet that I'm looking for some caffeine or something to get me through the next 45, 50 minutes of grueling exercise. And, I think for me, the actual ramifications of caffeine in terms of sleep I probably didn't connect the dots as much back then because I was burning so much energy all the time. And, as long as the days are, you do finish around sort of 4 o'clock, ideally, if the schedule's going according to plan. Often that spills off into later in the evening, but then basically you eat dinner and go to bed, particularly in preseason. The thing that I think is more impactful is that, in particular, when I played at Etihad or Marble, as it's now called, when you play under the bright lights under the roof, it's a very synthetic feeling environment. The light levels are really, really high, as they are at most of the AFL grounds at night, obviously, so you can see the ball. But then you've also got the added stress that if you play a 7:50 game, you don't walk out of there until about 11:45. And then you've got to drive, depending on where you live. Sometimes boys were driving 30 or 40 minutes home. And then you add in all of these factors, as well as caffeine, as well as, sugar and really high salt content foods, as well as eating food really late at night, all which are not contributory to a good night's sleep. You can understand why that, in combination with the impact of, the mental strain of the game, makes it very, very difficult for players to get a good night's rest.
Absolutely. And there's so much that we, the sleep field here in Australia and around the world, know about managing that in, like, a lot of the work has been done in shift workers, and more recently now looking at elite sports people with managing the lights, fatigue, caffeine, napping, appropriate napping and timing. And I think there's lots more that can be done. But I think back to your point around the mental health and the strain. I heard you speak. I followed you. You're on and off the field. I knew about your being quite open about mental health struggles and leaving the game, but I hadn't heard until last year you talking about the sleep loss and the difficulty with sleep. And we know that sleep, I think you say insomnia and mental health issues, particularly more prone to being anxious, more prone to having low mood, is a bidirectional relationship. We know that, meaning that it's a chicken and an egg scenario. And often, and someone my age, when I did my nursing and we did my psychology studies, we were always taught that anyone who had insomnia, any kind of sleep problem, it must be that they've got some kind of, it's a manifestation of their psychological problem. And so no one ever really thought to look the other way around, that the sleep problem might be the first thing that precedes or, triggers the first ever episode of not coping well with their mood or their anxiety. What's your take on what happened with you, or anything else about elite people and that relationship between their insomnia and their mental health?
Yeah, I mean, everything for me was anchored on sleep in the initial stages. I'm not sure I know if for the whole span of the probably 4 years that I really struggled, that there was, that there wasn't an input from both sides. I mean, particularly because I was in such a pressurized environment where there was so much criticism and accountability required and expectation and performance anxiety and all of that sort of stuff as well. But to be frank, in the beginning, the first issues I ever had was when I was in Sydney, in terms of my mental health. And the first one was just, I couldn't get to sleep. So I was sitting there lying at 11 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night, 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, just racing thoughts. And then it was really quite strange that after a month or two of that, where, 4 or 5 nights a week, I'd be having an issue of some sort. Now, it wasn't the exact same every night. Sometimes it'd be 11 o'clock. Sometimes I'd get to sleep at a good time. Sometimes it would be really late and really disrupted. After a while of dealing with that, there certainly was an element of stress and anxiety. And I think a lot of it is, when you have a job that you don't have a choice but to be there all the time, every day, which many, many people do, don't get me wrong, you find a way to manifest the necessary energy to just get enough out to just do your job. And particularly when it's a physically straining job like playing sport is, which brings out all wonderful chemicals in your body, you can kind of work your way around it somehow. But over the course of my first preseason, where, you're doing 60 or 70 Ks a week on the training track, you're in the sun all day, you're doing weights, cardio, like we're doing everything. It's exhausting. And I'm not sleeping properly as well. After a while, my sleep actually changed quite a bit, where it wasn't getting to sleep was the issue, it was staying asleep. So all of a sudden I was so exhausted. It was like, head would hit the pillow and 2 seconds later I'd be asleep, but 20 minutes later I'd be awake. And then that would just keep happening. And so by the time you get to the morning, you're like, well, technically I've slept 8 hours, but in reality, I've barely slept at all because I've never gotten into a deep sleep that's actually going to, constitute some recovery.
Yeah.
And then later on, it became obviously much more severe. And basically we got to the stage, particularly in 2017, when things had sort of spiraled out of control, was that there was no point trying to fix anything until we fixed our sleep. Like, because I was sleeping so little and I had such, terrible symptoms associated with that fatigue and anxiety and depression and all that sort of stuff. The number one goal for me once I took a time off was basically to put a circuit breaker in my life to try and find some rhythm with my sleep.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work to do, isn't there, from as a society, and perhaps advice for, did anyone, because this is back 2000 and what, before, around 16, you said it was, or before that it was started. So we're talking 7 years ago or a bit more.
Yeah, more. 2014 was the first issue.
So, nearly 10 years, and we know more now about sleep. There's a lot more research that's been done. What's your advice to any young athlete, or the, as they say, the young tomboy, or the 18-year-old watching this, or who's a footballer who's about to be elite, about to do those big games? any advice that anything you would do differently now that we know what we know, that there are sleep solutions more readily available, or we need to, that's our job to make them more readily available?
Yeah.
Any advice?
I think it's, you know, I got asked this question today at another event, and because it was a mental health event, someone asked me, what advice would you give them for footy? And I'm like, well, learn how to run really good, because football is exhausting. And that's my genuine piece of advice. If you've got a good endurance level, you'll be okay. If you don't, you won't be okay, is more to the point. But the second thing I said was that one of the most important things that young players need to understand is what they're signing up for, because people don't tell them and people don't explain to them in detail what the life of an AFL footballer looks like. You know, they don't understand how much recovery is required. They don't understand how difficult it is to have extracurricular relationships, nor have extracurricular studies or exploits that you're interested in. They don't understand that the AFL Football Club isn't going to give you all the answers to make you the best athlete in the world. In fact, many of the players who have been incredibly successful go on above and beyond outside the footy clubs to find the right support at the right time. And quite frankly, there's a really easy reason for that. The AFL player's salary cap is like $15 million, and everything else that they have to do to put the whole program on for the year is far less than that. So the investment is into the player's salary. It can't possibly be tantamount to the amount of investment in the player's overall experience at footy clubs. And I would encourage all of you to drive past the different facilities in the AFL and see the differences in spending that have happened over the course of the years, because building a facilities is a tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars exploit, and most footy clubs can't afford it. So to get to the specific part of the question, the AFL footy clubs will give you light versions of advice around diet, nutrition, recovery. Recovery is probably a bit more hands-on because a lot of the recovery facilities are at the building. About, you know, learning outside of the game, about film study, but most of them won't be able to solve the sleep challenge for you. And I think going out there and trying to find best practice at an early age is really important, because like anything, Moira, I think when you try and fix problems when they're problems, so much harder, and particularly when they're severe problems. And when you're trying to juggle, like I was, the fact that you're on $1 million a year, you're getting injured because you aren't sleeping and you can't recover, you're getting sick, you can't concentrate, you're struggling to make good decisions as it is, and let alone just turn up and do your job. How are you supposed to go out and go, I'm going to completely revamp my sleep regime whilst I'm juggling with all of these other issues? It's not feasible. And so the encouragement I have with all forms of challenges that young people face, and particularly athletes, given that's the context of the question, is work it out before then, because you know, it's very difficult to work it out later. And if you notice one little thing go wrong, go and talk to someone who's an expert about it so that you can try and fix it then, rather than waiting till it gets quite severe.
And that's music to my ears, because that's what we would also think prevention. Really what you're saying is prevention is better than cure. It's much better so raising awareness, education, the whole mission of the Sleep Health Foundation and what we're doing and what we're talking about tonight is education, awareness. Us being able to say, hey, do you know how much we know about sleep, and we've got all these information, and maybe even clubs coming to us to say, hey, can you come and speak to us about sleep? That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, and maybe this flies a little bit in the face of your mission, but my perspective is, you know, it's not forever. Like when you're playing AFL football, you need more sleep, it feels like, than you ever need for the rest of your life to do your job properly, because it's just so physically and mentally demanding. So setting the principles whilst you're in the game is only going to help you for the rest of your life. When you scale back, maybe you don't need 10 hours sleep anymore. You know, I used to sleep in all the time because that's what I needed. Now I don't need to do that every single day anymore. But that's not to say that I still don't need sleep just as much as ever. It's just that it's just different because I'm not doing, as I said, such large quantities of exercise all the time.
Yeah. We could talk all night. I've got lots of other questions, but I wanted to just put it out to, I've noticed there's a question in the Q&A function. From Simone, this is a good question, was napping promoted or factored into your training day? I've seen sleep capsules in my work in AFL at clubs, but they were not well used. That's interesting. Did you ever those little sleeping pods that you can actually have a little nap? That probably wasn't at the Bulldogs.
No, it wasn't. We didn't have enough money to do that. They spent that all on some big recruit that they brought in from the Giants.
But napping's a great question. I wanted to ask about that too.
Yeah, so no, it wasn't actively promoted at the Bulldogs, and we didn't have the facilities for it. And also, you know, I'd be interested to see the uptake on them, because it's kind of like, hey, we encourage you to go and study at university, but good luck finding a time to fit it in.
Yeah.
Because if you're at the footy club and, you know, the boys, like us as a playing list, like our pet peeve was the inefficiencies and absolute like moronicness of the scheduling at different times. And I'm not trying to make it all pity on AFL players by any stretch, but on Tuesday mornings, we were often required at the club at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And then we'd have these huge gaps in the middle of the day where we were expected to do, you know, extra training or extra touch or extra weights or extra film study or whatever. But often a lot of the time we were just spent waiting for other things to happen. And unfortunately, there was never really an allotted time, which is like, guys, you've got 2 hours. Hey, you can go and do this or that. It was really much more like, you know, go off on your own and try and fit stuff in. I think that's one of the great, you know, mental challenges I have with AFL football clubs is even in times during the pandemic when they scaled back the salary cap by 35%, there was no real discussion around, well, what can we do with that 35% of time? It was just like, well, it's a pandemic. We have to deal with it. Even though the concessions that the AFL players made to move their families into a footy hub up in Queensland, you know, I had friends who had 6 months old that didn't see another kid up until they were, you know, 12 months. And the sort of just the inability for what I felt like was the inability for the clubs to go, hey, this is a great point in time for us to go, we want more allotted time to do things that are positive for their overall state of wellbeing. We want to cut down on the scheduling, because AFL clubs, for all of their challenges, they will fit in as much as they possibly can in the allotted time if you give them strict guidelines. But if you give them broad-ranging guidelines, they'll just make everything inefficient. So no, we didn't have pods to sleep in. We didn't have a huge uptake on that front. But I'd also be interested for the clubs who do have pods, whether they actually use them, because quite frankly, it's very difficult to fit in that during the day.
Well, we need to, we unfortunately need to sort of finish up. But the summary really, I think, is, we need to raise the importance of sleep, that it's especially particularly in that acute time, because we know that longer term bad habits can set in. And so it's great that it sounds like your sleep's good again and well treated. But we think it's a really important message, and that's why we do what we do. I wanted to just do a bit of a shout out to the screen I've just shared. I really want to encourage people to follow us on social media. There's our handles there. And we've got 2 QR codes. One's directly to our fact sheets. We have about 100 fact sheets on a range of different topics, made by, put together by sleep experts and reviewed regularly by sleep experts. And we also have a QR code for you to sign up to our newsletter. We'd love to keep in touch with you. So I want to say thank you to Tom. It was fantastic. I'd really like to continue the conversation another time. I think there's so much we can learn from your experience and should help us. We're led by people's lived experience, so it's really important to keep these conversations going, for us to know what we need to do next. So Shantha, welcome back.
Thank you, Moira, and thank you, Tom. Look, really appreciate you sharing your personal journey with us as well. Much of what you said really resonates in terms of the work that we're doing at the Sleep Health Foundation to raise awareness and understanding of how sleep health impacts upon our performance, our mental health, our physical health. I really love your the ways in which you talked about how your sleep health was impacted by not only, you know, the arousal kind of the game, but also what we would call the sleep hygiene factors, the physical environment as well, the scheduling as well. And so we know that there's a lot of work to be done in not just the AFL industry, but also those lessons could really translate to a number of different areas. So look, on behalf of the Sleep Health Foundation, we thank you for sharing your story with us. And thank you, Moira, as always, for really exploring this conversation as well. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks, Shantha. Thanks, Tom, and good night all. Over and out.
Bye-bye.